Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Amos Dory. I'm the Vice President for External Affairs for Ben-Gurion University. It is my great pleasure, honor, and privilege to present Stanley Fischer this morning. As a matter of fact, it is almost embarrassing or even insulting because everybody knows Stanley Fischer in this crowd, and I'm sure that everybody here admires him as a person and his policies and what he is doing. Still, Stanley Fischer has been the governor of the Bank of Israel since 2005. He brought with him a tremendous personal stature and reputation, which has had an invaluable effect on our international standing in the world. He has lived up to this reputation and has demonstrated his unique qualities of leadership, vision, determination, and courage in carrying his role. Professor Stanley Fischer was born in what is now known as Zimbabwe. He received his MSc degree in economics from the London School of Economics, and then his PhD from MIT University in 1969. He started off as an academic and was a professor at the University of Chicago, and then moved to MIT, where he headed the Department of Economics. He later became the vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. He then became the first deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and his last position in the US before he accepted his current position and moved himself and his family to Israel. He was then the vice chairman of the Citigroup. Professor Fischer obviously is the author of numerous books and articles. And this presentation will not be complete, of course, without mentioning one of the most important credentials. Professor Stanley Fischer is the recipient of honorary doctorate from Ben-Gurion University in 1998. Ladies and gentlemen, Stanley Fischer will speak today about Israel and the global economy. He will make his remarks, and then we will leave a few minutes for questions and answers. It is my great pleasure to invite Professor Stanley Fischer to the stand. Thank you.
President Professor Rivka Karmi, the Rector, Professor Tzvi HaKohen, Professor Amos Drori, thank you for that slightly exaggerated introduction, and since it was slightly exaggerated, I should mention I was born in Zambia. I got married in Zimbabwe. Also went to school there for some time. Mr. Roy Zuckerberg, Chairman of the Board of Governors, members of the Board of Governors, students of Ben-Gurion, and other ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. It was a pleasure to be here. I didn't realize how long ago it was that I got an honorary degree from Beersheba, but it was a pleasure to be here that evening as well. Among the others who got honorary degrees then was former Prime Minister Shamir and Eric Ben-Hamu, and I don't remember, the Peruvian author who later ran for president, Vargas Llosa. So that was an honor as well. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to talk about Israel and the world economy, but it's mainly about Israel. We are an economy thanks to changes which have been made in the many years since 1985 that is extremely integrated into the world economy in two respects. One, we are very open to trade. We import and export about 40% of GDP. That is, nearly half of total production in Israel is exported, and a little less than that, just somewhat less than the exports, is imported to Israel. So in terms of the flow of goods, we're extremely open to the world. And then over the course of the years, but particularly during the 1990s, Israel completely liberalized flows of capital to Israel and from Israel. I know there are some people in the audience who know what capital controls are about. I'm looking at one of them now from South Africa. There are people who don't know what they're about. They're the Americans and the Canadians, who never had to suffer from this particular form of intervention in the economy. In any case, now Israelis are free to invest anywhere, and foreigners are free to invest in Israel. And not only are they free technically to invest in Israel, they're also free from the viewpoint of what it is that people in Israel welcome. It's probably known that Warren Buffett's first foreign acquisition was of an Israeli company, Iskar, which he bought for over $4 billion. It really is a very fine company. And about a month later, I gave a lecture in Paris, and somebody stood up and said something which was, aren't Israelis worried that foreigners are buying their best companies? And I could absolutely, literally, truthfully say, I've never heard any Israeli say anything like that before. Israelis are proud that their companies have reached a level that others are willing to invest here. And that has been the case, and that is a completely different approach than what you find in most countries. So we're not only in principle open, we are in fact open mentally as well as legally. Let me start. What I'm going to do is tell you all the good news at the beginning and then tell you something about the problems we face at the end. I think the good news about Israel is about the current situation, and it's really remarkably good. It's better than we thought it was all during last year. We have to make a decision every month on the interest rate, and so we follow the economy very closely. The data all through the year worried us, and every time the revised data came out, what had worried us wasn't there in the data anymore. And exports were higher than the initial projections. Service exports were higher than the initial projections. And GDP growth, which was 4.7% in 2010, was higher than we had thought it would be at any stage during the year. So let me start with where we start, which is what one of the two variables of importance to us from the world is the level of trade in the world. And what you see in this slide is that, on the far right, is that, of course, in 2009 we had the worst year for global trade since World War II. Trade declined by 11%. That was the global recession. It was the worst global recession since World War II, which is to say the worst since the Great Depression. And there were an extraordinary 2 quarters at the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009 in which there were countries who saw their exports decline by 40% in the course of 4 or 5 months. And at that stage, everybody was very frightened. Nobody had seen anything like this, and nobody knew quite what was going to happen. But as you can see, trade bounced back to about 13% or 12% growth in 2010. And it's now rising at roughly the rate which has been normal in the post-World War II period, somewhere around 7-8%, is what is happening to the growth in world trade, which has always been faster, or at least it's bigger in both directions than what happens to world GDP. Now, if you look at those 4 years, you'll realize something, which is we did lose 2 years because between 2009 and 2010, the sum of that is essentially zero. And so instead of having 8% growth in world trade for 2 years, we had over those 2 years basically zero. So this was a recession which has left its mark on global trade, and you can tell how, whether people are optimists or pessimists by how they relate to this. There are those who say, well, we lost 2 years, we lost 15% in world trade, we lost about 10% in world, it's less than that, about 7% in world GDP, and then there are those who say, well, we're just going to get there 2 years later than we would have got there anyway. So those facts are both true. What about Israel? Well, this is a slide that I'm somewhat embarrassed to present, and I'll tell you why. We, the Bank of Israel, update our forecasts sort of comprehensively. We've got a model of the economy, and we produce all the numbers that we expect. So what you see there for 2011, our forecast of 4.5, is bound to be higher when we revise the forecast, which we will be doing possibly by the end of this week. So all I can tell you, the only thing my research department is willing for me to say is the forecast will be higher. I can add that the OECD just raised their forecast to say that Israeli growth in 2011 will be 5.4%, which we may think is a bit high, but I'm not telling you anything. And no doubt the 2012 number will also be raised. That is to say, if you look back over the period since the very tough time we had in this economy in the recession that started in 2001, that included the Intifada and the global recession and the end of the high-tech bubble, since the middle of 2003, with the exception of the Great Recession, we've been able to grow at about 5% a year, which is quite remarkable for a country at this level of income. China can grow at 10% because it's still poor. And if you do things right, poor countries grow faster than rich countries. Growing at 5% for a country at our level, which is about the level of income of Spain, above Greece, above Portugal, below Western Europe, only about two-thirds of the United States. Growing at 5% for countries like this is pretty good, actually. This is one of the best things that happened in the Israeli economy during the Great Recession. What happened to unemployment here versus what happened elsewhere. We started this recession with unemployment at its lowest level in 2 decades at 5.9%. After Lehman Brothers, we thought we'd find ourselves going from 5.9% to 9% unemployment. Instead, we got to a little below 8%, and then the economy started growing. Unemployment started coming down. It's now at 6%, essentially where we started. That is all the impact of all the terrible events, terrible from the viewpoint of the economy we've gone through with respect to unemployment have basically disappeared. Furthermore, you'll see there a period of flat unemployment for 3 quarters. That looks pretty bad. That was an outstandingly good period, because during that period, the reason that unemployment stayed flat was that there was a huge increase in the number of people looking for jobs. The labor force expanded. In fact, the number of employed went up very fast, but the unemployment rate stayed roughly the same. But this was a period of very rapid growth in unemployment in the second half of the last 3 quarters. A very rapid growth in employment and constant unemployment at the end of last year. Now it's resumed going down. So the labor market is working pretty well. We've had a surplus in the balance of payments since 2003. These are percentages of GDP, and it goes up and down. It is a surprise to some of the people sitting in the front row here, to Mr. Yadlin, for instance, that we are a country that has a balance of payments surplus. He never expected it. I never expected it. We thought we were constitutionally bound to have a deficit, and we're not. And the reason for that, I'll get there shortly, is this. The Israeli economy has been driven largely by the blue line that you see here, export performance. And in 1995, exports accounted for a little over 30% of GDP. 10 years later, in 2005, they accounted for 43% of GDP. The economy was growing during that period. So to raise the share of exports by 12% of GDP is very impressive. And later I'll show you some pictures which make that point more graphically. You'll also see something I referred to a few minutes ago, which is in 1995, imports were 8% of GDP higher than exports. The red line is 8% above the blue line. Now the blue line is something like 3% above the red line. That is, we export more, significantly more, than we import. So this is a very excellent performance. This is the private sector operating. This is the high-tech sector operating, and this has been the main source of the revolution in how people think about the Israeli economy, and in fact the revolution in how the Israeli economy behaves. Now, if you're a successful country and you have a surplus in the balance of payments, that means that people are paying you more money than you're paying them for goods. And if people want to invest here, that means people want to buy your assets. More money is coming into the country. Well, if there's more dollars coming in than going out, that has an effect on the price of the dollar in terms of the shekel. It causes the shekel to appreciate, the pressure of all the inflow of foreign currency. By the way, when I say dollars, it's dollars, euros, and many other currencies that are coming in. So when we say dollar, when we say in the Bank of Israel we bought dollars, but it doesn't mean we hold them as dollars. It means foreign exchange is there. That tends to cause the currency to appreciate. And here you have 2 measures of the exchange rate. One is the dollar rate. That's, if you ask an Israeli what is the exchange rate, he'll give you that number. That's a number as of a week ago. It's probably the number around, somewhere close to the number today, 347. It was 345 at the end of business yesterday, which was very light. And that's appreciated relative to the average of the first decade of this century. So the currency has been appreciating. This causes a tremendous noise in Israel. We get visits, we get visits from exporters and so forth. Some of them work in the Negev, and they come and complain about the exchange rate. And I have great sympathy for that viewpoint. I believe that if you're going to have to listen to complaints about exchange rates, an economy in which you listen to complaints because the exchange rate is too strong is a more healthy one than one in which you listen to complaints because the exchange rate is too weak. If they're complaining about its being too strong, it means they want to export, they want to succeed in the outside economy. If they're complaining about its being too weak, it means they mainly want to import. And Israelis really want to export. They're out there complaining about the exchange rate. The amazing thing is that, in fact, exports have grown very rapidly during this period. So although we've been very concerned, because underneath it all, as all the economics students in this crowd know, when the price of a good goes up, it goes down, I've got to get this right. When the price of a good goes up, usually it's tougher for the sellers of that, when the price of a good goes down, it's tougher for the sellers of that good to make a living. Well, the price of the dollar in terms of shekels has gone down a lot. It used to cost 10 years ago 5 shekels to buy a dollar. Now it costs 3.5 shekels to buy a dollar. So the exporters get much less shekels for each dollar they make abroad. Nonetheless, they've been successful in keeping exporting. One of the reasons, we think, is that this move of the shekel-dollar exchange rate is something which almost all the competition, except for the most advanced countries, is going through. Every emerging market country, plus Switzerland, has seen a big appreciation of their currency. We have a list of 17 countries, emerging market and Switzerland, that we compare ourselves with. We're actually not one of those which has appreciated the most. Switzerland has appreciated over the past year by 25%, Brazil by about 16%, us by significantly less. So relative to the countries which are not in crisis, our exchange rate, while it has appreciated, is not appreciated excessively. Now, it's very nice to emphasize all that, but underneath this is something which is very, very important, which is the fact that we have a government which has run a disciplined budget since 2003 in particular. We had a big recession between 2000 and 2003. You can see that budget deficit going up. It reaches 5% of GDP. Then a very tough program was introduced by the then finance minister, who was the present prime minister, Netanyahu, which, among other things, constrained the growth of government spending to 1% a year, adjusted for inflation. That's a tremendous constraint. Obviously, it creates problems for those who want to get a bigger government expenditure in various areas. But in terms of improving the state of the economy, it was remarkably important. And by 2007, the Israeli budget was essentially balanced. This is something quite remarkable. Then the recession began. The deficit, I think by accident, rose to exactly the same place it had been 6 years before. This was at the height of the Great Recession. The government then set a range of targets for the deficit: 4% in 2010, 3% in 2011, 2% in 2012. I guess they're going to make those targets. So we'll be back very soon with a very small budget deficit, and that is a large part of the basis for the fact that this is inherently a strong economy. The government is not having to raise too much capital. It's not having to borrow too much, and this helps the private sector and helps our international standing enormously. Here we have a problem. The ratio of public debt to GDP in Israel was very high in 2003, essentially nearly 100%. In fact, in the original data, it was above 100%. The revised data just below. Through this very tough budget and these declining deficits and growing at 5%, the ratio of our public debt, the government's debt to GDP, declined to below 80% by 2007. All through this period, the economists were busy explaining to the government that no respectable country has a debt as high as 80% of GDP, and you've got to stay tough and get that debt down. And you'll see it barely went up during the Great Recession. Well, if you look at the debt of the United States, it didn't barely go up. It went up like a rocket between 2007 to where it's expected to be in a couple of years, around 80%. In the UK, it's risen way above this. And 80% now looks like something which a lot of countries have. That's not, but I don't mind, we'll continue to make the argument that the debt is too high, because it is too high. And it's not that we've become good and they're setting the standard. It's that we've become better and they've become worse. And that's part of the problem that several of the countries, leading countries in the West face, is that they've borrowed a lot and their debts are very high. And that puts a big strain on the economy. This is a chart. I have to confess that even people who try to be disciplined occasionally introduce a redundant chart. But I saw this in somebody's presentation, and I liked the chart so much, and I found it very appealing. Somebody, I don't remember who it was, somebody divided the world into countries whose, you can see the four quadrants: declining debt and deficit, bottom left, rising deficit and declining debt, and then top right, the real problems, which is countries whose both, let's see if this works. Here we have rising debt and deficits. Those are countries whose situation looks pretty bad. Here their debt is rising, but their deficit at least is declining. You see some countries there that have a problem. And here are those whose debt is declining and their deficit is declining. And it even looks like we may be the best among them. So this is not where you would normally have found Israel 10 years ago. And it speaks to the fact that there's been a huge change in the way this economy is managed. And if you look at the other countries in that quadrant, you'll see a series of pretty well-run economies: Norway, Canada, Sweden, Korea, Switzerland. That's the company we keep these days. I hope we'll keep on keeping it. I managed to go right by the high rate of inflation in Israel, but I have to come back to it. The job of the Bank of Israel is to keep the inflation rate in the target range, which is between 1% and 3%. What you'll see looking at the red line, which is actual inflation, is that we are an average around the target range, but we have difficulty staying there. And this is not good. The average is still about 2% over the past 10 years, or the past 8 years. So that's okay, but it's very variable, and it's currently high, in part because of rising oil prices, rising food prices, things happening internationally, and in part because of things happening domestically. House rentals are going up. There's a boom in the housing market. In any case, what we do is manipulate the interest rate, which is the blue line here, in order to control the economy. That's our main job. And as you can see, as the global recession began, Lehman Brothers over there, we cut the interest rate very sharply from 4.25% to 0.5%. We had enormous luck in doing that. I'll explain how. It's because we have Yom Kippur. We knew at the beginning, we change the exchange interest rate at the end of every month. We knew at the beginning of October, soon after Lehman Brothers, that we had to cut the interest rate. And then we tried to figure out when to do it. We had to do it because it's clear the world was going into a big mess. So we tried to figure out when to do it. Well, it turned out that you've got to give the banks a few days' notice so they can adjust all their parameters. So there's only one day we could do it. And so on a given day, I think 3 days before Yom Kippur in October 2008, we cut the interest rate by 0.5%. And people were a little surprised because we did it outside the normal cycle. We didn't do it at the end of the month, we did it at the beginning of the month. But then where our luck came in is the next day 7 countries, all the major countries, announced that they were cutting their interest rate by 0.5%. So everybody thought, wow, Bank of Israel is now the leader. They're in contact with these guys. I wish that were true, but the truth is we don't talk to each other about interest rates, except in the most general terms. Central banks don't go around telling their buddies what they're going to do tomorrow. And you'll understand why. If you think if I ask a governor of some country what he's going to do tomorrow, if he tells me, he must be telling another 50 guys. And you've got to keep it secret. So we don't talk about it. We didn't discuss it. It just happened. And so that was fine. We got some credibility out of that. Then we continued cutting very sharply. Then I'm going to accelerate this talk a little bit, but I want to tell you one more thing. Here, at the end of July 2009, we raised the interest rate by 1/4, from 1/2 to 3/4. We were the first country to raise interest rates coming out of a recession. Everybody said, woo, they were very brave. Well, we weren't very brave. We had we have a good committee that decides the interest rate, and one of the guys said, well, when we cut the interest rate to 0.5%, we thought we were facing a recession and negative inflation. And you can see negative inflation here because that was expected to be about -1%. This is what the markets thought it would be. So we got to -0.5 thinking we're going into a recession and negative inflation. Actually, we're growing, and not only don't we have negative inflation, we have inflation near the top of the range, or just at the top of the border. So if it was right, if 0.5% was right before, it can't possibly be right now. It's too low, and so we raised the interest rate. And we've been raising it since. We're now at 3.25. We have to operate in a way that keeps the inflation rate under control, and that's the basic factor behind interest rate increases, although it's more complicated than that. Now I'm going to have to accelerate. I want to tell you a little bit about the high-tech sector, and I'm going to have to go a little faster than I've done so far. Israel is exceptional in high-tech. You see, the first respect in terms of how much a country spends on R&D as a percentage of GDP, this is private and government sector. We are highest among the OECD countries, the advanced countries. We spend more as a percentage of GDP than any of the other countries, including Sweden, Finland, Japan. Now, if our GDP was that of the United States, then we'd be a huge factor in R&D, in high-tech, in research and development. Well, our GDP is small, so 4.7% of $220 billion is about $10 billion. That's a lot for our economy. It's nothing for the United States. So it doesn't automatically make you a leader in high-tech. It just means that a significant proportion of your resources are devoted to research and development, and that's a good thing if you want to be innovative and to grow. Of our exports, 49% are defined as, of the industrial exports are defined as high-tech and 29 as medium high-tech. Those are definitions that are agreed internationally. So that's 80% of our exports are high or medium tech. It's over half of total exports that are high and medium tech, and that's the revolution that has propelled this economy. What are they? Well, you see pharmaceutical products taking an increasing share. Those are the black ones on top, and the rest is mainly electronic in several ways. These are goods exports. We are also increasingly exporting services. How do you export services? People open research facilities here, and almost every major high-tech company has a research facility in Israel, in the computer field, has a research facility in Israel, and the payments that are made from abroad to those people count as exports. This is what's happened to high-tech exports. They've gone since 1995 from under $7 billion to nearly $20 billion. And there you see the progress that has been made. There's the bump there for the year of the high-tech bubble. And now $20 billion is somewhere around 9% of GDP. That's very, very high by global standards. And there we are. Now, the flow of financing for startups declined after the Great Recession. As the Great Recession got underway, we were getting above $2 billion a year. We're now operating at a range of about 1,300 million a year. This year is going at a slightly faster rate. There are problems in the VC industry, in the venture capital industry in much of the world, and what's happened to us is typical of what's happening everywhere. Now, I said I'd end with the bad news, so I'm going to end. There are international surveys of what it's like to do business in countries. There are many of them. One of the most useful is the World Bank's survey, Doing Business. And what you see about Israel is, in the respect of doing business, as in many other things, Israel is a country of remarkable contrasts. If you look at our international ranking out of 183 countries, in terms of protecting investors, we're very high. If you look in terms of the ability to get credit domestically, we're very high. The banking system works. It's efficient. The overall financial system is efficient. Trading across borders, we're pretty good. That's partly because the borders are right next door to everywhere, and it doesn't take too long to get the goods from where you are to the ports. But that's not bad at all. Then there are things in which we're truly atrocious. They have to do with construction. Number 121 in getting a construction permit. Number 147 in registering a property. Those are not good. By the way, in enforcing contracts, the measure is how long does it take. It's not, are they enforced? The enforcement is there under protecting investors. It's just that it takes a while to get the strong protection that you get. Now, this is not great news, but there is good news in it. The Treasury uses this table every year to see how we're doing and to try to figure out where to focus their efforts. And there are areas where there should be there is low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and we should be able to do better fairly quickly in a range of areas, particularly in the construction area, and improve our international standing and improve. So we're not doing this because this is a sporting contest. It's a contest about how well the economy will do, how encouraging it will be for foreign investors. And I always say, we always talk about foreign investors. Guess what? They do a very small proportion of the investing in Israel. Most investment in Israel is by Israelis, and if it takes foreigners 147 days to register property, it takes Israelis 145, not 3. And the same things that are true about foreigners are true about domestic citizens. These are problems for everybody who wants to invest in Israel, not only foreigners, and these are things we should be dealing with. Finally, I want to talk about two problems. One is poverty in Israel and the associated issue of education. Our educational standards are slipping. There are points at which we are just excellent. This university, a variety of other universities, even though the international standing on average of Israeli universities has declined, I think that's not a decline in absolute standards. It's a result of a lot of countries spending a lot of money on education around the world. Our school educational standards are declining more rapidly, and that is a very, very serious issue. It is intertwined with the problems shown here, which are poverty rates. We are reaching the point, because I'm going to look now at just this chart. The poverty rates among two groups in the population are very hard to believe. This is the non-Arab, non-ultra-Orthodox population. The poverty rate has been more or less constant for well over a decade among that population. Among the ultra-Orthodox, the poverty rate continues to rise to a level that is very hard to credit, and the same thing in the Arab population. And those are two groups among whom poverty is concentrated in Israel. The educational problem and the poverty problem are interrelated because in the ultra-Orthodox community, you have a group of people who do not believe in secular education, and by and large, and who study in religiously oriented schools and in yeshivas. Less than 40% of the male ultra-Orthodox population is in the labor force, the formal labor force. If you're not working, then you're not enjoying the benefits of growth and you're becoming progressively poorer. That's what's happening there. In the Arab population, the situation is more complicated. There is undoubtedly an element of discrimination in these poverty rates. There is also the distribution of occupations. Arab men tend to work on average, in more physical occupations, and they retire younger. So the participation rate is on average lower. Participation rate among Arab women is very low, under a quarter are in the labor force. But there's a very interesting statistic, which is of those Arab women in the labor force, they actually earn very well because they're by and large people who've gotten education. And it's the one part of the population where women earn as much as the men in the same grouping, because they tend to be in professional or teaching jobs which are relatively better paid. In any case, if you ask what are the problems we need to worry about, it's not what's happening on the macro side. I mean, you should never stop worrying about the macro side, the stuff we do or the stuff that Treasury does, but we've managed that well for at least a decade, and quite actually for 2 or 2.5 decades. It's what's happening to the trends. It's what's happening in education, educational standards. It's what's happening in poverty and social gaps. And of course, it's in what's in our geopolitical situation, which I haven't mentioned. If you want to ask what is impressive about Israel, it's that it has a high defense burden. It has the highest in the Western world. Despite this, you see the achievements that I've been talking about. That's very, very impressive. But we are subject to more uncertainty than most countries, and we just have to prepare for that. And you prepare for the possibility of tough times by what's called in English battening down the hatches, by being ready to deal with whatever shocks, economic shocks I'm talking about, may await you. That's one of the reasons I'm pleased we have much higher reserves, foreign currency, than we used to have. But mainly, and now I'll draw things together, people say, how come you got through this recession so well? Well, we did things during the recession. That's not the main reason we got through it so well. We got through it so well because we were in good shape when it began. Good banking system, good budget, balance of payments in surplus, low inflation. That's why, when the shock came, we were able to handle it so well. That's why we've got to maintain that, because other shocks can come, and we will be ready for them, I very much hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Fischer, for your enlightening presentation and talk. We will now have time for only a couple of questions, as we are in a rush to continue with our board program. So if there are any questions at this time.
I have two questions. One, I don't believe you referred to a very major problem of our economy. That is the overconcentration of our economy with some 20 families and so. This is a long-term problem. How do you think it could be handled? Second question is personal. As an Israeli, I believe I speak for all Israelis that are extremely proud today that a fellow Israeli by the name of Stanley Fischer has been nominated by importance, not nominated, but recommended by very important circles and media throughout the world. To be the next chairman of the International Monetary Fund. I think we're all interested, and I believe there might be some media here that will be extremely interested to hear your reaction to this. Thank you.
On the concentration issue, we are pretty concentrated, and it is the Bank of Israel's annual report for 2010, actually 2009, which I recommend you read. It has what looks like a pointillist painting. I don't remember the page, but you'll find it. There's a peculiar-looking chart, which you can't quite understand, with dots which are connected. Well, the dots, the connections between the dots means you're within a particular business group. And you take one look at that chart and you say, wow, then you try and figure out who are these people, and it takes about 10 seconds to figure out who are these people, and that's what really set this thing off. We are concentrated. Let me just say two things. In a small economy around the world, there is more concentration. There are economies of scale, for instance, in banking. We have two banks, each of which is 30% of the banking system. There's no such thing in the United States or in very big economies. Why is that the situation here? Why is it the situation in a country like Australia? It's because you need a certain scale in banking. You can't do what they have in the States and have 8,000 banks and get them to be competitive because computer systems are expensive, there are economies of scale there, and so forth. So more concentration in a small economy is common and unavoidable. That is not to say that the level of concentration that exists is optimal. And there is a committee appointed by the Prime Minister and I think also the Finance Minister looking into this now. And the question is not is it good or bad, the question is what can you do about it? And they will be asked to come up with measures and one of the measures is finding some way of dealing with the pyramidical, I don't know what, anyway, the pyramid-like structures that exist in the economy. With respect to the second question about the IMF, well, thanks very much. When I was in the job market at MIT looking for a job, the professors briefed the students, said, look, there are some things, there's a mistake everybody makes, don't make it. Don't accept an offer nobody's given you. So it's not, I mean, this is very nice, you know, to read all these nice things is more pleasant than reading what usually goes on in the Israeli press. But the fact is this is an election which involves governments. The nominations aren't all in. They'll be in by June the 10th or 11th. And then there'll be an election. So it's just very early stage yet, and I don't know what's going to happen. And whenever I'm asked to discuss this, I say one thing which is very important. I really love this job, and well, we'll see what happens.
The growing diplomatic isolation of Israel, which is a fact, has so far minimal effect on the retail level in boycott of Israeli products and so on. For an open economy like Israel, are you ready for a potential tsunami which happened in Rhodesia, which is very different from other countries? So it's a problem we have to be ready for.
Well, I mean, we look at all the eventualities that should concern us in how we think about the global economy and the global environment. So it would not be accurate to say that whatever happens won't affect Israel. Of course, there are many things that could affect Israel, as we saw in the Great Recession. But we hope that the changes in the environment, if they happen, will not be too large, and we have to think about how we would deal with it, but I don't think we would have to talk about it that much.
Okay, we'll take one more question.
You have to take one from that gentleman who I happen to have known for a long time.
It would give me more pleasure.
Thank you. Are you not worried about the American economy? It is in a situation where it is rated as a possible candidate for not being able to meet its own debt. And the low rates of interest are causing huge problems, you've mentioned, on capital flows, causing huge increases, false increases in the value of currencies around the world. So you're not able to control your own currencies in countries, and you can't get a stable exchange rate. Now, is that not something that would worry you, particularly if you're thinking of raising interest rates to create even further appreciation of the shekel?
Yeah, well, in two things. One about the American economy and the second about Israel. Yes, the fact that our interest rate is now over 3% higher than that in the United States that the Fed has is a problem. That's why there's a lot of short-term money coming into Israel, and it makes our problem in controlling the inflation rate more difficult. But you know, you have to deal with the world as it is, and that's what we do. Am I worried about the United States economy? Yes, because despite everything, the United States economy is still the largest economy in the world and the most influential in a way that is not described by the fact that it still produces about 22% of global GDP. Its capital markets are very important, much more important than 22%. What happens in in the New York and Chicago capital markets affects the whole world more even than does the fact that the U.S. accounts for 22% of global GDP. So the world economy will not be healthy until the United States economy returns to health. Now, it's doing better than Europe, but it's not there yet because, in part, the housing sector is still, housing prices still going down, and that's a significant part of GDP, and it's a drag, and so are other things. The exchange rate, part of this adjustment, the U.S. had too large a current account deficit in the balance of payments at the start of this crisis. The dollar had to adjust, and it's in the process of adjusting. It may be adjusting too much relative to currencies like ours and Brazil and others, but that has to do with China and not with the United States particularly. And when China eases up, as it's slowly doing, that situation will begin to equalize. But, you know, on worrying about the United States, everybody worries about the United States because it's important. There's an old story which is attributed, most Israeli stories are attributed to Ben-Gurion, but this one is attributed, whether they are or they aren't. You can. This one is about Prime Minister Eshkol, who was finance minister. It is said that somebody came to him and said, "Terrible problem. We're heading into a drought." And he said, "Where?" He said, "In the Galilee." He said, "Phew, I thought you meant Iowa." So there we are. Thank you very much.